Right here we have Jonathan Latham. He's the Executive Director of the Bioscience Resource Project, and he's going to talk to us about the EPA. And you're welcome to stick this on here. All right, everyone, let's give it up. We got one last presenter.
Right, thank you everybody. I really hope you've had a great day today. And I'm not quite sure where Jeffrey is tonight. He was supposed to introduce me. But I wanted to just say one thing about Jeffrey because I know he is controversial in some circles. And the thing I wanted to say was that, you know, he used some of our research for his book, Genetic Roulette. And, you know, I've never met anybody who was more careful to get the facts right about what we wanted to say in that book and to understand our research properly. And so I want people to know that. And we really appreciate that approach to science and explaining biology. So the talk that I want to give tonight is, we got the slide, great. So what I want to talk about tonight is fraud in chemical safety testing. That's what primarily the talk will be about. The reason for talking about fraud is that, firstly, it is important in its own right. So if a chemical is given to rats and bound to be harmful to them and the information is not relayed properly to the regulatory system and so forth, then there is no basis for a scientific regulation, right? There's nothing good that can come out of that system as a consequence of that. The second reason why I want to talk about it is because I believe it's a very neglected subject. It's neglected by the media, it's neglected by the legal system, and it's also neglected by the by the media. I'm just realizing I don't have my water up here. Does anybody know where I was sitting just now? Because there's a bottle of water right there, and I would really like that actually at some point. Thank you, Lewis. So, but the main reason why I want to talk about it is that I believe that the prevalence of chemical safety testing fraud has very important things to say about the nature of regulatory agencies like the EPA, and that these agencies are misunderstood by us. When we make demands, environmentalists often make demands about the EPA, for example, that to close the revolving doors so that we can have better people who work in the EPA. Also, another kind of demand that's commonly made is for more funding for that agency. Or another one is to ban single chemicals at a time. And so environmentalists have for many years made these kinds of demands of the EPA. And what they betray is a misunderstanding of these organizations, but also these demands show that people have fallen into a trap. That's generated by the academic system and the industrial companies that are regulated by the EPA, because the EPA doesn't work this way. So, and this is going to become important because, you know, we're facing a situation, as Ronnie was suggesting earlier, where there's likely to be political change, and we in the food movement need to know what we want from these institutions and why we want it, so that we can explain our demands properly and formulate them accurately. Just going to work. Oh, great. I have to face it that way. So that's just a little bit about our work. So we run a website called Independent Science News, and I'm the executive director of the Bioscience Resource Project, which is a non-profit, and we are the publishers of this website. And I would encourage people to subscribe. So there's on the website, there's a subscribe button, and it's really, I really want people to subscribe, even if you're not quite sure whether you want our information or not. You won't get very much of it, but it allows us to keep in touch with you. So I consider that the information we share is high quality. I'm not saying you won't get very much of it because there's not much of interest, but it's of high quality, and but not, you know, you won't get an email in your inbox every single day. But in these days of Facebook and Google and people manipulating the internet, our ability to keep in touch with you is extremely important. So, and the overall framing, which is of our our work, which has come out in several places in the discussions today, has to do with the centrality of food and agriculture to the problems that we as a planet face today. So we have major problems with people's health that derive from the food system and the products of it. We have major problems with drinking water. We have major problems, as just mentioned, with immigration, the quality of water in rivers and lakes, effects of climate change, which are primarily derived from problems in the food system, and the food system represents an excellent solution to these issues. And so our work is basically devoted to try to understand that food system and how it functions, because there are many misunderstandings in that. And the way that I'm going to talk about fraud in chemical testing is going to rely heavily on the poison papers. Now, the origin of the poison papers lies with this lady here. Her name is Carol Van Strum. On the right of this picture is Peter von Stackelberg, and he is one of the people who helped to scan these documents. And what these, essentially the story is that in the early 1970s, Carol was homesteading. This is her picture taken in her barn. She was homesteading in the woods of Oregon, and a plane comes over, and her family and her animals and her property is sprayed, and subsequent to this spraying, her children became sick, some of her animals died, fish died in the river. And she didn't make any connections because there's a time lag. And until this happened all over again. And they also, there were stories locally too of people having miscarriages and so forth. And so what happened was she embarked on a 30-year project to try to understand more about what EPA knew about these chemicals and why they were causing her animals and the fish and her children to become sick. And what she discovered first up was that what she was being sprayed with was Agent Orange. So EPA was, or the woodland management people were spraying Agent Orange widely in the United States as a weed-killing ploy. And so what she discovered, so we basically helped her digitize these documents. We raised money to do that. Basically, she collected, through Freedom of Information Act requests, through collaborations with lawyers and working with lawyers, and through whistleblowers who sent her information, she ultimately ended up with 20,000 documents, 2.5 tons of paper that derives from the internal documents of the EPA, the Forest Service, many government agencies, also companies, and these are mainly about dioxins. So dioxins are the main reason why people become sick from Agent Orange, although the individual chemicals are not necessarily innocent. But what happens is that these chemicals are contaminated with dioxins. So the poison papers are also about PCBs. They're also about, in a large measure, about pesticides. And I just want to acknowledge the people who are involved in that project. So there's Carol, but there were other sources of documents too. Peter was involved at several stages in the project. And we were the organizers along with the Center for Media and Democracy. And we got financial support, for example, from the Park Foundation. So testing fraud, right? This is a local example. Some of you may know what's going on at Hunters Point. What's happening at Hunters Point is that Hunters Point is a former naval shipyard that was used to decontaminate ships that came from the Pacific that had been involved in nuclear testing. So the site appears to be covered in heavy doses in some parts of radiation, and a company called Tetra has been hired at a cost of $250 million to remediate the site so it can be developed. And Tetra, if the media reports are to be believed, has discovered that it's cheaper to take the most contaminated soils from that site and label them as uncontaminated and ship them out, rather than tell people or remediate them. And so, well, there's two stories here, right? One is Tetra doing this. The second part of the story is there are no penalties, right, for doing this. This is a ridiculous fine. and it ends up being waived on appeal, right? So even though Tetra Tech employees are going to prison at this point, that's not, nothing is being done about this. And what this is an example of is conflicts of interest in the chemical testing world. So Tetra Tech is not about testing chemicals on animals, but these examples are, right? So if a chemical industry body, a company, develops a new product, say a pesticide, they think they want to put it on the market, they will do some animal testing almost certainly themselves, but ultimately they will send that samples out to an quote-unquote independent chemical testing laboratory, and then that chemical testing laboratory will send reports back. Say, for example, it might be a 2-year chronic toxicity and carcinogenicity study of a rat variety. They will send that report back to the chemical industry, and then usually a summary is sent to the EPA or the FDA. So what you need to understand about this, though, is that the chemical testing laboratory is a customer of the chemical industry, right? The chemical industry can perfectly well go to a different lab if they don't like the results, right? So there's an inbuilt and very obvious conflict of interest going on between these two institutions. And the history of industrial chemical testing is that a whole series of labs have been discovered to be fraudulently testing chemicals and sending those reports to the industry and then on to the FDA. So the first of these examples I'll just go into very briefly is a company called Industrial Bio-Test Laboratories. So this case finally wound up being kind of completed, finalized in 1983, quite a long time ago. What essentially happened was that a researcher called Adrian Gross, who we will come across more in this discussion, what happened to him was that he was working at the FDA and he was reading reports sent to the FDA by Industrial Bio-Test, and Industrial Bio-Test Lab reports, as far as he could understand them, were basically fraudulent. And so he took it upon himself. Nobody at EPA was interested in doing anything about it, so he took it upon himself to go visit Industrial Bio-Test, who was based in Chicago. And what he found when he got there was this, right? Basically, animals being kept in conditions that were completely basically impossible to understand in a scientific sense, right? There's no scientific experiment going on here, but there certainly is some kind of fraud and misreporting. And so this case went to court, and what was finally discovered, what came out of that court case, at least this is the official version of what happened, is that IBT was conducting between 35 and 40% of all US chemical testing. So thousands and thousands of studies, hundreds and hundreds of chemicals were being tested by IBT. So all of Roundup testing, for example, was done by IBT, chronic and short-term toxicity testing. Same for atrazine, same for 2,4-D, dicamba, and many, many other compounds, especially many pesticides. At IBT, what the court basically discovered was that IBT was falsifying data on a routine basis. Animals were being swapped in and out of experiments as needed. There was very high animal mortality. And very high animal mortality basically means you can't get good results, because if too many animals are dying, you don't have the statistical power anymore to actually detect harms. They were faking controls, and they were forging each other's signatures. And IBT, for example, had also hired Paul Wright, a Monsanto employee, to test Monsanto's PCBs. And IBT, when the crimes looked like they were going to be discovered, basically set up 6 shredding machines in the car parking lot and started shoving all their records through them. And they claimed in court that this was done by mistake. And 3 IBT staff ultimately went to jail. But one of the interesting things that emerged from all this study was that IBT actually turned out to be owned by Nalco, which is a chemical manufacturing company. So it wasn't, and IBT wasn't even nominally independent of the chemical industry. So, and this is the official story, right? Is the EPA prosecuted IBT, sent people to prison, had a look at other laboratories, and organized replacement studies. But that turned out not to be the end of the story, as we can show from the poison papers. But I just want to go into another example. This is the Stanford Research International, which is a lab that still exists and is down the road from here. And was spun off from Stanford University a few years back. But in 1977, EPA was sent a letter by a whistleblower at Stanford Research International who told EPA that the main objective of chemical testing was to please Shell rather than conduct accurate testing, that incorrect amounts of pesticides were being fed to animals, wrong pesticides were being fed, members of staff were faking figures in the data and in the reports, that animals were dying and not being recorded, and tumors were not being recorded. In other words, they're underestimating the harm from Shell pesticides. So, but what's interesting about these examples is not very much happens after these. So IBT, three of their staff went on to serve prison terms, except one never served any time at all. That was the CEO. There's another example, Craven Laboratories, which tested 48 different chemicals and was shown to have done so fraudulently, and one person was sent to prison. In the case of SRI, EPA basically ignored the results of their own investigation. So their own investigation confirmed the findings of or the allegations of the whistleblower, but the EPA, well, not just basically did nothing. And there are other companies too, and often they get pats on the wrist and so on and so forth, but essentially nobody else has been sent to prison for this. So, but what the poison papers reveal is actually a story that is much worse than this. So the poison papers reveal, we have the minutes of a secret meeting that took place between EPA and the chemical industry when the IBT, not long after the IBT scandal broke. And this is the letter inviting chemical companies to come to that meeting at a Howard Johnson in Arlington. What happened was, at that meeting, is that EPA revealed that the fraud at IBT was much worse than they claimed, but also that basically all of IBT's research was garbage. And what should have happened with that research is it should have just been thrown away. Right? There was nothing salvageable about this research. But the problem with throwing out IBT research is that causes problems for the chemical industry, right? Because if you throw it out instantaneously, their products are no longer validly on the market, and they will probably have to legally be removed. And so EPA, it seems, didn't want that to happen, and certainly the chemical industry didn't want that to happen. And that scenario could be prevented if basically EPA strung along its investigation, even though these reports are obviously fraudulent. And here's another example of the kind of problems that there were with the IBT research. So the EPA official says, we have encountered many studies that, although they may have been started as two-year rat studies, for example, actual termination occurred after 18 months. Now the problem with terminating an experiment early is that most of the harm accumulates late in the study. So basically terminating a study underestimates the harm from these chemicals. So that's a form of collusion, right, between EPA and the chemical industry, not necessarily between the EPA and IBT, but in these examples, this is collusion with either IBT or the chemical industry. So the EPA official says, in this case, as far as I know, IBT reports are still reaching scientific conclusions. They are just not attested to by signature, right? Now, no rational agency accepts reports from a company that's presumptively fraudulent, whose employees won't sign their own reports, right? This is total madness. But this is basically what was happening at IBT. They were still accepting reports, and for no good, basically for no good reason. And then the EPA official rather says, we have had very good cooperation, I think, to date with IBT, and I think we recognize the problems they went into trying to pull together some sense out of 20 years worth of record keeping, and I keep my fingers crossed. Now, this is interesting, right? So how often, when a crime is presumptively been committed, do we allow the person who is presumptively the perpetrator of this crime to collect the evidence against themselves, right? We don't normally do that. And here we have a company that was known to be shredding the data, right? This own data. They've set up these 6 shredders in the car parking lot, but EPA is basically saying, well, we won't send in our own people, we won't subpoena them, we're just going to keep our fingers crossed. And what the poison papers also show is more evidence of testing fraud. So this has nothing to do with IBT. This is the reason for me showing this to you is because this is testing fraud by totally other different organizations. So this is the case of the insecticide Permethrin that was eventually approved in 1982. So these studies there were 7 studies conducted by ICI, which is British, the Imperial Chemical Industry, FMC, I've gone and forgotten the initial standard, but it's a chemical company. Biodynamics is an independent testing laboratory, and Burroughs Wellcome is a chemical company. And this is Adrian Gross, the person who had discovered the IBT scandal, who now is working at EPA. And in a letter to the head of the Hazard Evaluation Division, he's asking EPA to investigate the studies done by these registrants, because he's concerned that these are not they're basically fraudulent. And he points out this is particularly important if we keep in mind that for those experimental studies on permethrin, which were audited by us and for which pathologists of our own choice have examined the available material, it was determined that either such studies had major flaws in their execution, or that the circumstances under which they were carried out were not truthfully reported to us, or the number of tumor-bearing animals in such studies was significantly underreported. So permethrin, for your information, this is the chemical structure of it, is a pyrethroid insecticide, and those companies were basically they were planning to manufacture permethrin. It comes under these trade names, and it's still commonly used in agriculture today. So it is it's used for just regular field spraying, but it's also, if you buy tick-proof clothing, it's likely to have permethrin in it. If you travel on a plane and they spray in the plane, that's probably permethrin. It's used on pets, it's used on babies, it's used on shampoos, and it's used in towns for mosquito control. So it's a very widely used pesticide, and this is the approved dose that EPA have ended up setting over the protestations of Adrian Gross. And the toxic effects of permethrin are nowadays considered to arise from neurotoxicity. But actually, what these internal EPA documents suggest is that much more than neurotoxicity, permethrin is a carcinogen. So this is Adrian Gross's, this is what I read to you earlier, was his summary, but he goes into details about what's wrong with these studies. He says, the fact that apparently no professional pathologist was in attendance at the time the experimental animals were dissected after death in order to record grossly observable pathologic alterations in their carcasses and tissues. So what he's basically saying is that they may have done a 2-year study, but if at the end of that study you have no competent person to look at those animals, then effectively no data is being collected as to the carcinogenic potential of that compound. So the study is a waste of time. And then about Burroughs Wellcome, he says, yet we find that in July 1981, the original toxicology branch reviewer of this study drew attention to the fact that the registrants originally reported virtually all tissues from virtually all animals in the experiment to have been examined histopathologically. The same information was given again to the EPA following a specific request for clarification. Yet, when we insisted on a signed statement to this effect from the pathologist who actually carried out such examinations, a very different story was presented by the registrants in September of that same year. So Burroughs' welcome is also misleading EPA. So, and ultimately, his conclusion about permethrin, I've rewritten this because it's hard to read in the text. But what he says is, in summary, the evidence is overwhelming that permethrin has a marked tumor-inducing or carcinogenic activity which is expressed in many different forms. I cannot see how anyone in complete control of his senses could place any kind of reliability in any study conducted according to such practices. In view of all this, I would conclude that none of these 7 studies can be regarded as having established that permethrin is safe from a carcinogenic point of view in a reliable fashion. So we come to the question, right? What is this telling us about EPA? If EPA is aiding and abetting fraudulent testing, then the question becomes, why would it do that? So, excuse me. So, and here is, as part of a letter also written by Adrian Gross. He goes, appended here as attachments 3 and 4 are copies of 2 memoranda issued in a single day there as recently as a couple of months ago. Each of those communications clearly indicates that whenever a carcinogenic risk is initially perceived for a certain product, so we're not talking just about permethrin at this point, this is a widespread phenomenon, an elaborately complex machinery is set in motion amongst its elements that are described in those instructions, tripartite reviews, a statistician and a pathologist expected to spring into action, a preliminary potency assessment, an ad hoc peer review, an exposure assessment, etc. It seems as if the purpose of all this intense scrutiny and activity is to minimize the possibility that any product initially or presumptively tagged as bad news will, is that 1 minute? Thanks. As bad news will finally emerge as such in an undeserved manner. What he's basically saying is that it's fine to look carefully into the data that you've received, but you can't only look into the data that is essentially incriminating your product. You have to look into all of the data, or else it just becomes an unbalanced philosophy, which is just to scrutinize the bad news until it disappears. So these are the mechanisms by which EPA is basically protecting the chemical industry. So they have an imbalance of concerns which are basically to remove, and I won't go into we're running out of time, so I won't go into all the details here, but essentially what the EPA is doing is looking hard at the data that appears to show a toxic effect and using various pseudoscientific practices to remove that as a seeming threat to the use of the product. Right? So this is a totally unbalanced and unbiased assessment of the data. And ultimately, he comes to the conclusion in the case of permethrin that the carcinogenic risk of permethrin might be as high as 1 in 10, right, for people exposed to the final dose. And that essentially, so you've got a bunch of things going on. You have scientific, you have pseudoscience, but also you have, for example, EPA not sharing information fully with external reviewers, external lawyers, for example, with other departments. So you have manipulation of the information going on. And I'll skip this slide. But basically he's saying, you know, we're disrespecting the health of we have contempt basically for the health of the American people exposed to potentially toxic products. So this is the kind of important slide, really, along a couple others. But essentially, we have this story of regulatory capture, right, which turns out actually that it came from the University of Chicago and a bunch of right-wing academics and economists. And what I would suggest is that we need a totally different understanding of the kind of regulation that's going on at the EPA. We need to understand that EPA, we need to understand that they're not seeking to indict chemical companies, right? What's going on at the EPA is that EPA has to basically square two needs, right? The first need of the EPA is not to confront the chemical industry, because the EPA knows that if they confront the chemical industry in Washington, essentially they're going to lose, right? If they go to the president and they basically say to the president, we want to ban Roundup, or we want to fine Monsanto $1 billion or $5 billion or tell the public that they've killed 100,000 people, that basically they're going to have to end up in an arm wrestle in Washington. And they're going to lose that arm wrestle because they're a small agency that no one cares about, and the chemical industry has friends at the presidency, it has friends in Congress, it has friends all over Washington. EPA is basically never going to be allowed to do that. And so essentially what people at EPA have to do is they're basically expected to bury the data. And everybody at EPA understands that their job is to bury the data. And so these complex machinations and the use of pseudoscience is basically an attempt to bury the data, but at the same time for EPA officials to feel that they are genuine environmentalists, right? They want to feel good about themselves. They don't want to feel that they are basically on the side of evil and aiding the chemical industry and killing people. So they use this pseudoscience as a way, and these administrative manipulations as a way of basically feeling good about themselves. But this is a very different concept than regulatory capture. This is a concept that basically permeates the whole. Yep. Okay. Thank you. So yes, and the last point I want to make is that essentially what we're doing, the very easiest way for EPA to achieve this result is to accept fraudulent tests. Right? That is a very simple interpretation of this acceptance of fraudulent testing. And what I was going to talk about was how that affects our strategies for demands that we should be making of the EPA. But I'll leave that and I'll stop there and thank everybody for their attention.